Okay. Well, this picture is actually from area of sub-Saharan Africa. That there are a number of cultures who are still in the hunting and gathering phase of what we might call development, and the local governments are actually trying to get them to move into cities, move into housing, and get what we would consider more traditional work. But there's a lot of pushback because culturally, the population doesn't want to. The population wants to live by traditional means and ways that humans, most of human existence, right? We've been hunters and gatherers. So there's nothing necessarily unnatural about this lifestyle. And in fact, if anything, our industrial age might actually be a bit more wearing on our natural systems. When we're looking at development overall, there's a number of things to consider, one of which being that, the more recently a country was able to get independence, that is also, the amount of time that they've had control over their own resources, right? During the colonial era, resources were extracted from all these places. And if you want to see examples, if you go on a tour to just about any European country, you go to the giant palaces and the huge cities, and you'll see all that money and all that literal gold on the walls, right? As you can see from this map, there's lots of countries that gained independence a bit earlier, the US being one of them, but there's plenty of countries where it was all relatively recent that they've been able to have resources that are own or even structure their own economies. There's been lots of terms that have been used through times to talk about development, and a lot of these have become outdated, although still used. You could still hear people use the term the third world a lot, right? People will be like, oh, that's the third world, or blah, 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 the third world. And very often people use that term just to mean a place is less developed, but it's a pretty vague term. Well, and it's a term that is from a long time ago. It's a term that came about during the Cold War, when there was basically an East and a West divide between capitalist countries and communist countries, right? You still have a bit of that divide, but it's faded quite a bit. And the third world at the time just meant countries that weren't aligned to each side, right? It was not necessarily a judgment of whether those places had developed or not. And people still will use that term, usually vaguely to refer to countries in the global south, which is another term that's used sometimes. But this is also a term that is increasingly, becoming less used because you have many countries in the global south that are developing, and their economies are growing to the size that they are competing with what have been traditionally the rich countries of the world. A map, again, from the time frame showing first world, second world, third world. And during this time frame, part of the reason for this terminology was, that there'd be proxy wars, meaning that there'd be countries that were stuck in the middle that both the East and West would fund their military campaigns or their civil wars. And so what would have been often a minor internal conflict turns into a gigantic catastrophic war because of the armaments coming in from other countries, right? I would say to some extent, we see this playing out in Ukraine quite a bit because, it's an area of the world that the armaments on each side are being supplied by the rest of the world. Russia, although there are all these tariffs and whatnot, if you look at the data, they're still getting armaments and whatnot from other countries. They're just getting it under the table. And the Ukraine itself, not getting armaments or anything under the table, getting armaments and everything very much in public view. But again, from the rest of the world, right? So this internal conflict has grown to be huge. even the term development, developing, developed, these are all like a bit problematic, right? In geography in general, they've moved to, instead of saying third world or things like this, they'll say often more developed or less developed, right? Because even the term developing, a developing region, it's not that the U.S. isn't developing. It's not that we have stopped technological progress, that we feel like we're just done, you know? So technically every place is developing, and therefore it might be more useful to just talk about more developed or less developed. That is a relative thing that can be measured. Speaking of measurements, there's a number of different ways that we kind of classically measure how developed a place is or isn't. Gross domestic product, right? The amount of stuff that your country makes, measured in how much basically items are sold for. This is a very common measure. Very often people, when they look at this measure, they'll also do a per capita, right? Because gross domestic product, well, it might be interesting to know the total gross domestic product of a place like the US compared to Canada, but at the same time, Canada has like a tenth of the population, right? So if that's adjusted, you would see those countries are actually closer together than you would otherwise thought. Gross national product, total value of goods and services produced by a country's citizens and companies, both domestically and internationally. I would say the international aspect of that is a bit more relevant. Gross national income, total value of goods and services globally produced by a country in a year divided by the country's population, right? That's looking at that, or that per capita measure. Looking at a map of gross domestic product, you know, in general, countries that are larger tend to have, larger budget, right? They tend to have more population, and that's a tendency. But you see the map is maybe similar to what you might expect. And looking at this map, you could see why we don't really have the term of the global north and the global south, because increasingly there's countries that are in the middle that are moving up in the economy. Gross national income per capita, you can see the map changes up a bit. Per capita, again, that's just measured per person, right? It's one of those examples of, well, you know, if Bill Gates walks into the room, the average wealth would increase, but we don't really get benefit from that wealth, right? And so you get to the per capita. Income inequality, the divide between rich and poor. As you can see, there's a number of places in the world that have basically large elites that have a lot of money and that have control of resources. And then, well, usually these same countries, you have large amounts of people who are in extreme poverty, right? So you have these opposites in one place. And what you want for development, for a stable economy, you want a large middle class who could buy the stuff, right? You want people making stuff and people buying the stuff. If you don't have people who do one of those parts, your economy collapses. Some other measures of development, the formal sector and the informal sector. In a nutshell, the informal sector is the unregulated sector. Usually in some, in many countries, the informal sector is the kind of crime sector, right? It's I would say that I often use the example in the U.S. of a garage sale being the informal sector, because it's not regulated, you don't pay taxes, not that it's necessarily illegal, but that is actually how the economy is. In some countries, that's the majority of the economy, is people acting economically, but it not being regulated, it not paying taxes. And so you can imagine if most of your economy was not bringing any taxes in, then you would have no money for public goods. That's also a factor of why lots of countries have very high inflation rates, is because what they will do is they will just basically print out more money, so there can still be an amount of public services, and then inflation is basically a tax on money, right? Print out more money, each individual dollar decreases in value a bit. Not that you shouldn't print out money, you should, but it should be very tied to actual products that you're producing in your economy, right? I know that the US went through a big surge of inflation pretty recently, and that is actually, well, it's connected to the pandemic, even though the inflation part didn't hit us during the pandemic. During the pandemic, productivity went down, right? A lot of people were at home and not working, so productivity and the amount of stuff went down, but everyone, well, money was still flowing. People were still paying their bills and whatnot, and it took a while for the economy to kind of basically catch up with the fact that we printed out more money than stuff we were making. And well, it seems like we've caught up quite a bit now. Inflation rate, by historical standards, is back to norms, basically. So there's lots of indications of development that are not connected to the gross national income and things like this. Right? There's fertility rates, infant mortality rates, basically health statistics, literacy rates, life expectancy, access to health care, measures of democracy, right? Things that are correlated with human development, but a lot of these numbers are more fuzzy, right? Like measures of democracy, well, how do you categorically quantify that? It's difficult to do. It's not impossible. Plenty of people do it. Sometimes it's obvious if a place is very non-democratic versus another place, but the numbers can get a bit muddled. Human Development Index. So this is basically, in a nutshell, statisticians' attempts to put together a bunch of these different measures of development, so that we're not just looking at how much money people have, but for example, well, Amartya Sen, who's a famous economist from India, he has what he calls the capability approach, which is not just how much money you have, but what can you do with that money? Can you have health care with that money? Can you buy products that you want and need? Are there products that are inaccessible to you, even though you might actually have the money for it, but the way that your country is structured, you just might not have those resources. Life expectancy, education, a lot of these different measurements are all kind of brought together. And when you look at these numbers, again, it's a pattern similar to what you might expect. Some countries are very high, some countries very low on this index. Other ways to map development, well, not very often used, because when we talk about numbers that are a bit fuzzy, happiness indexes, right? Happiness indexes, they're becoming more and more popular because it's a measure that people feel is important, but they're, again, difficult to narrow down because you have to wonder, well, they're self-reported, right? And so you wonder if there's some cultural context. You might be in different countries of the world where they evaluate happiness just in different ways. This is data from the US, 2017, and I'm a bit surprised, honestly, because I would think the warm states would be happier in general. In Minnesota, weather-wise, I would just expect this to be a bit different. But of course, there's an indication of lots of other things going on. One of which being, on average, Minnesota has a very good economy, very good standard of living, good health care, a lot of these different things that, although the southern states, they have sun, but they often don't have these other measurements that would lead to happiness. World happiness, again, this is one of those measures that it's difficult to be scientific with an indicator like happiness, and these are self-reported. But this is, if you look at this map, you'll see that your happiness level is relatively correlated with wealth, but not completely. There are some places that are more wealthy, but, the self-reported not happy with that wealth, right? Plenty of other places that are relatively poor, but seem to be happier on average. When it comes to development and development aid, development aid is a bit controversial because you always have, people in countries who feel like there should not be money given out to different countries for development assistance. I would say, if you look at this map, you'll see on average a lot of development assistance is given to countries not only because they're poor, but often because, in this case, the U.S. The U.S. wants these countries to be more politically aligned, right? And I would say, if you look at this, you could see places like the West Bank and Gaza that are in the news a lot. This is data from 2017, but you can see these are all, the blocks show the relative sizes of how much aid they get. And you can see that a number of places get quite a bit of aid compared to others. Ukraine, of course, being larger than any of the neighboring areas in that region. Let's see what else stands out. And then there's also specifically security assistance, right? This is money that is given to countries to keep them stable, basically, right? These are countries that if something goes wrong, that could lead to instability in the region. And then you can see Israel jumps up in the amount, right? Quite a bit compared to neighboring countries. And you can see that there's entire regions that, the amount of stability apparently doesn't matter too much as far as U.S. priorities. Our last chapter talked about this a bit, looking at gender and development, because a lot of these averages that we see, they are not broken up by gender, right? And so you don't know, looking at a lot of the data, unless it's broken up, what's going on in these places, So I would say, for example, a lot of illiteracy statistics. It'll have percentages in different places, but then when you look at the data, you'll see that, often the males will have a relatively high amount of literacy that is comparable with more developed places, but then the women, right? Our textbook talks about a number of specific cases, specifically in, places that the Taliban have somewhat recently taken over, where they outlaw education for women, right? And that's one of those things that, when you're looking at development, in general, education leads to development, leads to better life outcomes. If you're, taking more than half your population and trying to take them out of the development statistics, you have a place that might be a bit stuck, right? Won't actually develop. Number of ways to measure this, of course. The chart we were just looking at shows you the index of how we basically just kind of split it up. It's only somewhat recently that development has kind of focused on the fact that women's empowerment in these different countries can lead to better outcomes, not just in economics, but in health, measures of happiness, political stability. If women are taking part, all these things tend to rise. Another measure, percentage of women in national legislatures. You can see there's a wide range. This graph from the book doesn't label specific countries, which is actually unfortunate. This shows different larger categories. But again, you can see this mimicking the other maps we've seen when it comes to development measures. Female participation in labor market. If you look at this geography, you could see basically that there's a number of countries where culturally women haven't been allowed to be part of the development process. They've not been allowed to kind of progress through society. And in general, that is seen as holding these places back from basically rising and developing it in line with the rest of the world. Another good graphic, girls' education levels in 2019. Like I said, there's a number of countries where girls and women, their education is cut off at certain ages, and then basically if your education is cut off, you're not able to participate in the larger economy, right? Statistics like literacy, well, if you're illiterate, how much are you going to be able to go online to problem solve things you want to do, right? The internet and whatnot, you need to be able to read. Our text talks about a number of different ways that women are becoming parts of the economies in lots of different places. I have a specific example. Microloans. Microloans, where are they? How are they useful? Well, in a nutshell, if you want to go into business, right? What will you do? It's like, well, your first step might be to maybe get a loan from a family member, but possibly you don't have a family member that has that kind of money, so maybe you go to a bank. Well, a bank is going to ask for in some type of assurance that you'll be able to pay that back, right? These things are difficult, and around the world, well, a lot of women don't have a history of financial records and whatnot, so it's difficult for them to get loans for whatnot. But also it's been found that a lot of women around the world who want to start up their own businesses, they don't need a ton of money. And so microloans are a relative new thing that have come about in an attempt to kind of, help people bridge that gap, right? And a microloan could be an amount of like $20, maybe $100. Very often you'll see situations where women will pool resources and they'll get together and they'll each get their own microloan. So far, microloans have had a very successful rate of payback, something like 99% so very successful so far. When I was in India, I toured a facility that was financed with microloans. Manufacturing in India, and what they did was you had a bunch of women who they had their kids have grown up, and they wanted to start their own business. This is a paper making factory, and what they do is, internationally there's a lot of clothing donations around the world. People, give clothes to Goodwill, and you wonder, well, where's that go? Some places they get too much shirts, too much clothes that are sold, that there's not enough people to wear them, or they might be inappropriate for the climate, right? But the cloth still is made up of valuable fibers, and so what they do is they take a bunch of these and basically tear them up and break them down to their fibers in order to make them into paper. That's a bunch of shirts and whatnot you see here being torn down. Inside, like I said, it's not the most high tech, but it is a small business. This is where they break down the fabric and materials. And like I said, this is a company that is all run by women, which is a relatively new thing in parts of India as well as the rest of the world. And it's a group of about 30 women who all got their own microloan, and they pooled their resources together to start this business. You can see some of the paper pressed there at the side. And these are the final products. And so when I said they're making paper, it's, like kind of fancy paper, I guess. And this was at the store there, but I've seen these exact products on local stores, places like Patina, places that sell kind of like nice gift cards and whatnot. If you buy any and you look on it, it might have come from India, it might have come from this area. This is a little, another small business that I visited in India was a woman who was starting her own cooking classes. And she lived in what is a middle class area of India. And this is, I'm just going to kind of show you the area. As you've probably heard in India, the cows walking around and whatnot. I would say in general, the architecture of these homes have a very definite kind of private and public space, which is kind of a norm for the region. These are all self-built houses, and you'll see that there's mostly brick and concrete used. There's been a history of deforestation, and wood is rare and is quite expensive. Like I said, this is she opened a business that was out of her home, doing cooking classes, and also, well, since tourists come in to take cooking classes, they also are able to sell snacks and stuff to people and be relatively prosperous. I asked if I could take photos inside their house for my class and whatnot, so this is just like a little shrine that was inside the house, not uncommon. Like I said, it was self-built, so it's kind of still in the construction process, but you still see kind of normal stuff you would see in a kid's room. They were still putting in their electrical and whatnot. And this is the meal that we ended up making for ourselves. I don't know, people like Indian food. This is above a lot of the doors, a bit of a good luck symbol. And this was the kitchen, and this kitchen was most of India itself for cooking and heating. What they do is, it's very ecological. They burn manure for these things in most of India. But in places like this, where they're dealing with people that are tourists, they will use gas. A little bit of India there. So like I said, things like literacy rates, when you break them down by sub-regions, the big maps that just kind of show one value per country can be a bit misleading, because inside you could see that there's lots of ups and downs to these statistics. Also a map looking at when we're talking about percentages of the economy that are the informal economy. You can see here that places like the US, very small percentages the informal economy, and I would say places that tend to be more developed, the aspects that are the informal economy would be things like, well, the drug trade, right? Just about everything else is pretty standardized, pretty regulated, but lots of countries, as you can see, most of their economy is informal, which means that there aren't things like worker rules and regulations to protect people from abuses. You don't have, you might even have laws requiring things like building codes, but you don't have money for enforcement. And so when you have earthquakes and whatnot, you could have a lot of damage compared to countries that have more of a formal economy. Actually, I'm not going to do case studies. Theories of development. Well, there's been a lot of different kind of theories of development through time. One of the very influential one was Rostow, who came up with these stages of development. Each one would kind of build on the other, and there are a number of critiques of this model. One of which being that it was based off of the development in England, which, as we know, is one of the first countries to industrialize. And not every country can develop like England did, right? Because England also had giant territories around the world, including the U.S. for a time, that it was able to draw resources from. And so England and a number of countries in Europe especially, because they had these international presences and they were taking resources from much of the rest of the world, they were able to develop much more rapidly than they would have been able to otherwise, right? And this model is often held up as an example of what less developed countries could do. But like let's say you're a less developed country, let's say you're Haiti, you can't rely on having control of half the world's resources like England did, right? It's like you have your own resources and that's about it, right? I previously talked about this. Theories development as we move forward through time. Like I said, there's actually quite a few different theories of development, and a lot of them had their problems, and so a lot of them have kind of risen and fallen through time. One of the ones that's stuck around a bit is Wallerstein's world system theory. Basically because world system theory basically acknowledged that you have a core set of countries that are developed, and historically they've often taken resources, whether that natural resources or cheap labor, from less developed countries, right? And those cheap resources, those core countries relied on those cheap resources for their development. And so as these less developed countries attempt to develop, and they only have their own resources, sometimes they don't even have their own resources, right? Because those resources are controlled by other countries. This theory more shows the limitations of development and how countries can kind of basically be stuck and can't get through those stages of development. This is a map showing Wallerstein's. As you can see, on this example, they use China as kind of being in between a core and periphery country. I would say, I think this map is from 2018. In 2018 even, I would say China has made great strides to invest in Africa, for example, in order to try to get a foothold and gain resources. China's been, for example, having contracts where they will build dams for different countries in exchange for natural resources. And a number of countries thought this was a really good deal at first, but then, well, China would help them build a dam and give them hydroelectric power, but then China would also only staff it with its own Chinese people, and then the locals never really kind of got the expertise of the technology. They felt that they would be able to learn from this and make their own dams in the future and whatnot, but China was very kind of controlling with any information that got out, and if any countries wanted to by force take back that infrastructure, well, they would basically break it first and then leave. But like I said, China, it's like, I would say that they're more in the core area now. India has made great strides now in trying to basically replace China's power in the rest of the country by basically trying to give places a better deal. And well, we don't know where that struggle will ultimately go. Many are predicting, we talked about this in our population chapter, many are predicting that India will basically overtake the economy of China in the not too distant future, but we really don't know because crazy things like pandemics happen, so you don't really know. Dependency theory, I would say, in general, people kind of confuse dependency theory a bit. They think the dependency theory talks about how less developed countries rely on aid from more developed countries, but dependency theory is more about the fact that developed countries, to maintain their high standard of living, they need cheap inputs from less developed countries. So in a number of ways, it's in the developed countries' interest to keep less developed countries less developed, right? Because if they develop, then they are selling things that compete with your goods, right? And so that's been one of the critiques of the IMF and the World Bank, who push for free trade around the world, right? And free trade has some benefits to it, but part of the worry is that it makes a number of countries basically stuck in those first levels of development where you're just extracting primary, like raw materials, and your population can never basically, well, industrialize and make products that would compete with those first world countries, right? Got plenty of time here. Well, as you all know, I'd like to have you work on some stuff in small groups. And we've got plenty of time today, so I'm going to do the card thing. just so you can maybe talk to people you don't talk to all the time. Actually, stop this.